This is Tao of Chow with MTG Forge, and today I want to talk to you about one of my favorite decks to play called Lantern Control. Now, Lantern Control is normally known as an abomination by most people. The players that like it really like it, but almost everybody hates to play against it. Now, before I continue, I just want to apologize. I still have a raspy voice because of my cough that I've been having for 5 or 6 weeks now. I feel like I'm almost over it, and hopefully I'm on the mend, but you never know. This thing is just, I just can't seem to shake this. Alright, anyways, let's talk about Lantern Control. So, Lantern Control is a pretty competitive deck. It's pretty expensive. It probably costs about $1,000 to put it together. Alright, in paper anyways. Yeah, it's not really the kind of thing you just play at the kitchen table or anything like that. One thing I should mention is it's not a good deck to play against beginning players, especially if you want them to get into the game. So if you're trying to draw them into the game, don't break out Lantern Control. Okay, because it just makes the game not fun for anyone else to play, except for obviously the person who's piloting the deck. Okay, I have the deck, but I rarely ever, break it out against any new players, just for that reason. Just because, I want them to play with me again, and so if I break this out, they're not going to want to play. All right. So, the deck revolves around one card called Lantern of Insight. Now, Lantern of Insight says players play with the top card of their libraries revealed. Okay, well, it seems like a really innocuous ability. Like, who cares, right? Okay, so you get to see what I'm going to draw, and I get to see what you're going to draw. Great, right? But that's actually the key to our deck. So, what we do is, once we know what our opponent has, or has on top of their deck, we know what they're drawing, and we know what their basic game plan is. And that's actually a ton of information. Okay, now what we do then is we have several mill cards. Okay, so we've got Codex Shredder. This is a 1-mana artifact. Tap and target player puts the top card of his or her library into the graveyard. Okay, well, we also have a similar card called Ghoulcaller's Bell, and each player puts their top card of their library into the graveyard. Okay, and then after that we got a Pyxis of Pandemonium, where each player exiles the top card of his or her library. So it doesn't go to the graveyard, it just goes into exile. And that's actually important. I'll talk about each one. Okay, so the first one is Codex Shredder. Now, Codex Shredder is just targeting one person, usually your opponent, but sometimes yourself as well. Okay, the reason why you target yourself is that sometimes you're looking for a particular card, and you really need it right away, and so you can use the Codex Shredder to mill your own self on your opponent's end step before you draw your card, so that you can try and draw into that card. Alright, now the second ability, 5 and tap for sacrifice Codex Shredder, return target card from your graveyard to your hand, is relevant as well, but not used very often. Okay, so sometimes you just really need to get an extra card back from your graveyard. You can do that and basically trade off the Codex Shredder late in the game. Right, so we have second card is Ghoulcaller's Bell. Okay, so basically the same thing, except both players have to mill their card. Now, again, this is sometimes a pain because sometimes you don't want to lose your card, but you really don't want your opponent to have their card, so you have to get rid of your own card. But it's generally a good call, mainly because we have a lot of graveyard recursion, right, which I'll get to in a bit. Okay, so lastly, we have Pyxis of Pandemonium, and that's to deal with cards with like flashback and things like Emrakul, where if it goes to the graveyard, it's going to shuffle back into their library. Right? So Pyxis of Pandemonium is only a 1-of because it's not really that useful. All right, so it's useful when you want it, but it's not really, like, generally we want things to go into our graveyard so we can get them back, because as I said, we have forms of graveyard recursion. Okay, namely, the first one is Codex Shredder, right? So you can use 5 mana, sacrifice Codex Shredder, return target card from graveyard to your hand. All right, so what else do we have? Well, it's actually quite an interesting package here. We have to deal with what our opponent started their hand with. Alright, so because we can't control what they started with. So what we have is some Duress, okay, Gitaxian Probe. Now, Gitaxian Probe draws us a card, but we also get to see what's in their hand, so we know what we're dealing with to start with. Okay, so let's say, for instance, our opponent kept a 1-lander. Right, well, what we might want to do is, instead of milling their actual playable cards, we might want to just mill away all their lands and just prevent them from keeping any lands on top. And that way they just basically sit with 1 land and never can do anything. Okay, additionally, it helps to draw us a card, which is actually useful sometimes, especially, for instance, let's say, for instance, your opponent has a card that you want to get rid of, and you also want to get rid of, you want to get your card. So if you have only a Ghoulcaller's Bell, well, you can get rid of your opponent's card, but you got to get rid of the card that you want as well. Well, if you happen to have a Gitaxian Probe, you can pay your 2 life, or if you happen to have blue mana available to you at the time, then you can draw your card and then use the Ghoulcaller spell and mill those cards away. Okay, so after that we have Surgical Extraction, which allows us to target a card in a graveyard other than basic land, and then you can search their opponent's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of cards, basically any number of cards that they might have, and get rid of them and exile them. Okay, and it also forces them to shuffle their library. It's actually a nice play if they just scryed and they put something to the top, and then you take away one of their key pieces and then force them to shuffle away anyways. Okay. Anyways, then we have Duress and Inquisition of Kozilek, which are basically just forms of hand disruption. Inquisition just recently went down in price by quite a bit due to its inclusion in Conspiracy 2. So that's actually a nice one, and Duress is dirt cheap as it goes. Alright, so now after that, we have some Spellskite, a 3-of. Now, Spellskite is basically there for things like burn and bogles and stuff like that. So whenever there's a target of a spell, we can redirect it to Spellskite. That's actually pretty important because we've got some really bad matchups, and if we face one of them, it's really hard to deal with. But Spellskite's always a nice blocker as well. It's a 0/4, which means it's out of lightning bolt range. And if the opponent has to waste a burn spell on it, then okay, great. Okay. Probably the key piece for our defense is Ensnaring Bridge. Okay, so creatures with power greater than the number of cards in your hand can't attack. That means, if essentially by turn 3 or 4, you're going to be at 0 cards in hand. The converted mana cost of this deck is like 1.3 or something like that. It's ridiculously low. So by turn 3 or 4, you'll probably have played out all the cards in your hand, and you're basically just going to wreck them with Ensnaring Bridge. They will not be able to attack you with creatures. Now, you do have to be careful of things like Noble Hierarch and mana, and Birds of Paradise, or something like that, because they have 0 cost, or 0 strength. Power, I should say, and when they attack, they can attack with 0 and get pumped afterwards. Okay, so especially if they have like a Noble Hierarch, it can attack, and then once it attacks, it gets its Exalted trigger, and then you get 1 damage from it, so your opponent can ping you down with that. Alright, now ways of dealing with other things. Okay, so we've got Abrupt Decay. So Abrupt Decay is a way for us to deal with basically anything else that our opponent might have that might be kind of bothering us. Okay, so certain enchantments, or if they've got a Noble Hierarch or something like that, you can actually use this to destroy them, which is actually a pretty nice include. Okay, Pithing Needle. Pithing Needle is really great to take care of planeswalkers, but it's actually pretty awesome to put this on a person's land as well, especially because this is a tier 1 deck. You're generally playing against other tier 1 decks, and they have a ton of fetch lands. So when you see them drop a fetch land, or if you use a Gitaxian Probe and you see they've got a bunch of fetch lands in their hand, you can name that fetch land, and then basically they can't play it, or they can play it, but they can't ever use it like to fetch a land, which is pretty awesome. It's also good against Tron, to put it on an expedition map or something like that as well, right? So to basically help you take them off of Tron or prevent them from getting it. Okay. There's Pyrite Spellbomb. Now, Pyrite Spellbomb is actually nice because it basically does double duty. Usually, I found that I use it to draw a card, but sometimes doing 2 damage to a target creature or players can either close out the game, or you can get rid of that Noble Hierarch or Birds of Paradise or whatever it is that's bothering you if it's a cheap card. It's also good, for instance, if you have like a Soul Sister or something like that coming out really quick. Now, it's also part of our secondary win condition where we use this Pyrite Spellbomb to attack our opponent for 2, to do 2 to their face, and then we basically recur it back to our hand and then just do that over 10 turns. It's like the death of 1,000 cuts, and people hate it. That's part of the reason why people hate this deck. Alright, finally we have Ancient Stirrings, which is a 1 mana reveal the top 5 cards of your library. You can reveal a color as a card from among them, put it into your hand, put the rest in the bottom in any order. Okay, so Ancient Stirrings is actually a really great card. It helps us to find the pieces that we need, and you rarely ever regret getting it unless you just don't have the green mana to cast it, right? But it's still worth the include, and I've never really had a problem with it in there. Mox Opal, usually people put like 3 in there in the deck, but it's super expensive, and I only put 1 in there. Basically, Mox Opal is just another way of getting mana online, which is, again, really nice. It's not really required, and I guess if you've got extra money to blow on it, then go ahead. All right. So, anyways, that's the key parts of the deck. Now, the way it generally kind of works is that, I should introduce the land first, sorry. The land package is the Academy Ruins. Okay, so Academy Ruins is one of our keys. So for 1 and a blue and tap, put target artifact card from your graveyard on top of your library. So all those cards you just milled with Ghoulcaller's Bell or Codex Shredder when you're milling yourself looking for your Ensnaring Bridge? Okay, well, you can get them back if you've got Academy Ruins online. Alright, so a lot of times, for instance, I've really needed to get that Ensnaring Bridge going, so I've been milling myself with Codex Shredder and Ghoulcaller's Bell, and I've gotten rid of a lot of good cards. Finally get the Ensnaring Bridge out, and then I can use Academy Ruins to get those cards back. Okay, same thing if I use Codex Shredder, I sack it, get a card back, then I can use Academy Ruins to get my Codex Shredder back. Now, Kaladesh was really nice to us because of their artifact cards here, or some of their love of artifact cards. Okay, we have this is not a Kaladesh card, but Blackleave Cliffs is basically a fast land for red and black. But Sea Gate Wreckage also is from Oath of the Gatewatch. So basically it's a blank mana card, but draw a card for 2, basically for 2 in colorless. Draw a card, activate this ability only if you have no cards in hand. Well, as I said, we almost always have no cards in hand. So this allows us, if we have the spare mana, which we almost always do, is just to spend that mana and draw the card that we might need from the top of our library. Okay, it's not something we'd use a ton of, but it is definitely a one of that we might want. Okay, so Copperline Gorge, basically, again, another fast land for red and green. Ghost Quarter to destroy our opponent's lands or things that might be bothering us. Glimmervoid. Now, Glimmervoid's, again, a great card because we have so many artifacts online. One of the keys is that, one thing I'd recommend is not playing this flat out right at the beginning. Like a lot of people will play like a Glimmervoid into a Lantern of Insight, and then their opponent just happens to have artifact destruction, so they destroy the Lantern, but then it also destroys your Glimmervoid. So try not to play it out as like in the first step if you can avoid it. Okay, now Kaladesh was super nice to us with Inventor's Fair. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 3 or more artifacts, you gain 1 life. Well, we almost always control 3 or more artifacts. Now, one of the worst matchups against us was Burn. Burn is really, really tough to deal with because they don't have any creatures, and so, or very many creatures, and so Ensnaring Bridge doesn't really help us very much. So one of the things, being able to get an extra life every turn is super, super nice. Okay, so then later on you can sacrifice your Inventor's Fair, search your library for an artifact card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. That's less important, especially by the time you're in turn 4 or 5, but it still might be pretty nice. Mainly though, getting 1 life from your land is just awesome. Right? After that we have Llanowar Wastes, 3 of. Basically it's a pain land. It's actually pretty good to have it as a pain land as well, and I'll show you later on when it combos with Sun Droplet. Okay, and then we also have a 1 of a Tendo Ice Bridge, which basically comes in with a counter, and you can just spend that counter and use it to get a mana of any color. It just helps you to fix your mana a little bit, but I'd say this card is not totally required. Now, we're only playing 19 lands, so we're kind of short on lands, but this deck actually mulligans really well. Like, you can mulligan to like 4 or 5, and you can still actually be pretty competitive, mainly because you can start getting controlling their draw steps. Ideally, you would want to have either a Lantern of Insight, well, ideally you want to have a Lantern of Insight and Codex Shredder and Ghoulcaller's Bell, but you have to make some decisions. Like, for instance, if you've got the Codex Shredder and the Ghoulcaller's Bell, but you don't have the Lantern, then you might want to go with it as long as you have Academy Ruins, for instance, or if you happen to have Ensnaring Bridge and you notice your opponent, let's say you're in game 2 or 3 and you know your opponent's playing a creature heavy meta. Okay, well, it might be better just to get the Ensnaring Bridge out rather than getting the Lantern right away. Right? Or, for instance, you might have a Codex Shredder, Copperline Gorge, and also Ancient Stirrings, and you can use the Ancient Stirrings to look for your Lantern of Insight. Right, so there's lots of actual like little tiny interactions that you can do here. It's like a lot of people think that Lantern of Insight's just kind of a mindless deck that you're just like milling people out without thinking, but it's actually not. You have to really know your opponent's deck and know what's important and what's not important for them to have. Sometimes like you might let a card that's kind of innocuous through, and that really just ends up wrecking you. Okay, the cards that you want to avoid letting your opponent have are cards that allow them to search their library, or cards that allow them to draw a card off the top of their library, or like a scry card or something like that. Well, a scry draw card. If it just scries, then it's okay because it puts on top, and then you can mill it out later. Right, but you want to avoid getting them obviously their main pieces, but you also want to stop them from getting things like I said, things that can affect their draw step. All right. So sideboard. Sideboard we have Ancient Grudge. Okay, so Ancient Grudge basically destroy target artifact, and it has flashback. Nature's Claim, very similar, target artifact or enchantment, and its controller gains 4 life. Okay, so these cards are pretty important to have against certain cards. For instance, one card that just wrecks us is Blood Moon. Right, so Blood Moon's an enchantment that says all non-basic lands are mountains. Well, that pretty much just wrecks our day, okay, because it's very hard for us to be empty-handed when we can't get black or green mana. All right, so Mox Opal helps a lot with that, but if you have a Nature's Claim, you can use your Mox Opal, get green, and then use that to destroy the Blood Moon. All right. Another card that really wrecks us is Mesmeric Orb. Like mill deck, a mill deck we can kind of control. Like we can control our way out of a mill deck because generally they have they will time out or they'll just fizzle. Okay, so you can just get them off their mill cards. But if they can drop a Mesmeric Orb, then you're really in trouble because now, usually whenever you tap, well, it's at the beginning of your step that you mill, so you really can't control the draw steps anymore, and it just makes things really hard. Okay, so your opponent taps, for instance, plays something. Okay, you basically mill them until they get a card on top of their library that you want them to have, and then at their upkeep or their untap step, Mesmeric Orb goes and like basically ruins your whole plan, right, by milling those cards away. So it's actually funny that mill is a really bad matchup for us. Okay, the other bad matchup is against burn. Okay, and you'll see there's actually quite a bit here against burn. So we have Sun Droplet as well. Okay, so we have Sun Droplet, Inventor's Fair, and Spellskite, all to help us protect against burn. All right. Pyroclasm is to help against token strategies, although we rarely ever use this card. Bow of Nylea is actually pretty sweet. Bow of Nylea, when you get it, being able to gain 3 life helps us against burn again. It can deal 2 damage to target creature with flying, which helps against like Delver decks and stuff like that. But also, being able to put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature is super nice as well. Now, you're not going to put on your Spellskite. That's not what it's for. It's for things like Noble Hierarch and Paradise Birds. So basically, what you can do is or Paradise Birds, Birds of Paradise. What you can do is you put the counter on their creatures so they don't have 0 mana creatures. All right? This put up to 4 target cards from your graveyard on the bottom of your library in any order. You rarely ever, I've never actually used that. Okay. After that, we have Grafdigger's Cage, so players can't cast cards from the battlefields or from the graveyards. Okay, Welding Jar, because you know your opponent is going to bring in all their artifact hate. If you're playing red or against red or green, or white, they have a ton of artifact hate. You need to sideboard Welding Jars in. It's only against black or blue that you don't really have to do that. Okay, and then Bojuka Bog, if you're a little land heavy or if you're playing a lot of dredge stuff, then Bojuka Bog is nice. It's kind of weird to put lands into your sideboard, but I've actually found that when I've needed them, they've actually come in handy. And it helps you prevent you from getting land screwed as well because you're bringing yourself up to 21 lands. Now, there's a couple things that you can do. There's some interesting interactions, and it takes a little bit of practice and creativity to see where they're at. Okay, so for instance, if you've got more than 1 Sun Droplet out, it means every time you take damage, each Sun Droplet is going to get a counter, which means that you're going to get double the life back. Well, what if your opponent didn't attack you? Well, one thing you can do is you can use Llanowar Wastes and tap it for a mana, even if you don't use it, and then you get 1 damage, which triggers both Sun Droplets, and then you get one extra life from it. Okay, so there's one example. Another thing is, for instance, you can let's say, for instance, you don't have Pyxis out yet, okay, but you accidentally mill your opponent with a surgical extraction. Okay, so you can you mill your opponent and your opponent's Emrakul, and then you have a surgical extraction. Well, the mistake has already been made, or let's say your opponent milled their own Emrakul. Well, what you can do is you can surgical extract it before it goes back into the graveyard or into the library. So you can't stop the rest of the cards from going back into the library, but you can stop Emrakul from doing that, and that's generally going to help you quite a bit. All right, so there's a lot of cards that are kind of like that, where they say if they go to the graveyard, then they go straight to the battlefield or back to the library. So surgical extraction is pretty nice like that. Ghost Quarter is pretty nice because you can use it to destroy your opponent's land, or sometimes you might have like a curse thing on your land or something like that. I don't know, but it's nice to be able to destroy your opponent's land. Now, one thing is that, let's say, for instance, you've run out of your milling, so you've tapped all your mill rocks or whatever, you just don't have them. What you can do is you can destroy one of their lands and force them to either give up, they can give up the land, or they can search their library for a basic. And if they search their library, they have to shuffle it again later. So it takes it off the top of their library. Same thing with the Lantern of Insight. Okay, so Lantern of Insight, as a last-ditch effort, you can always sacrifice your lantern, and then target player has to shuffle his or her library, okay, to take it off the top, take whatever crucial card you need from the top of their library. All right, but other than that, it's important for you to know what your opponent's playing, get a sense of what they're going to find to be important. All right. Now, one of the things I would suggest is do not mill your opponent until you get to their end step, unless you absolutely have to. All right, so you mill on their end step, and you basically wait until their turn to do the milling. Okay, now sometimes that's not going to be an option, they just showing too good of a card, you got to do it on your turn, or they have some weird card draw spell or something like that. Remember also the priority, your opponent might cast a spell that allows them to draw a card, but then you can respond by activating an ability sometimes. Right, so there's different ways you can handle, you can control your opponent. Anyways, that's basically the deck. It's one of the most hated decks in Magic the Gathering. People, I love playing it because I think it's really cool and it wins in such a roundabout way, but people really don't like to play against this, and a lot of times they'll just drop the game if they see you. They'll just scoop up and they'll be like, no, I'm not playing against you. Right? So if you're playing in person, it might be a good idea to bring a second deck, and by far, this deck doesn't win all the time. There's a ton of hate around it, especially because it matches up with Affinity quite well. So, Affinity, what I mean by that is a lot of people are sideboarding against the artifacts in Affinity, which just happens to sideboard badly against you as well. So it's not like people are going to be unprepared for you. Okay, so anyways, that's Lantern Control. If you have any comments for it, then please remember to leave a comment in the comment section. If you do like my videos, please like and subscribe. It really does help. And if there's something you want to see, then please let me know, because I want to produce things that you guys want to see. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. It's that time again for a random card review. So let's click on random card and see what we get. Anoint. Okay, so Anoint is from Tempest Remastered, probably also from Tempest, yep. Okay, it's a common, and let's see, for 1 mana, with buyback 3, prevent the next 3 damage that would be dealt to target creature this turn. Actually, that's pretty good. So you can also, it's nice that it has buyback, but yeah, you protect your creature from 3 damage. It's only 1. It's basically the anti-lightning bolt. So it's not a bad card. I don't know if I'd give it a 5, a 5-star rating, but I'd say it's pretty good. I'd give it maybe 3.5. That's my own rating there. Now, just one last thing I want to mention is that if you're ever looking at these cards and you want to know why they're rated that way, a good place to look is to check in the discussions. right? So often there's no discussion for this one, but often there are discussions where people talk about what cards they could combo with and why they're actually good cards or why they're actually really bad cards. So nonetheless, Anoint, I'd give it 3.5. Someone else gave it 5. But yeah, that's my random card review. Remember to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.